One of the benefits of owning a 26-year-old car is that there's always something up with it. While out for a drive in my BMW Z3, I noticed the brake fluid light was flickering on and off when I'd go up or down a fairly decent grade. As the label on the light suggests, the brake fluid is most likely a bit low. The easy answer and a common response is to top up the fluid. Simple and done. The issue with that seemingly reasonable solution is that it only treats the symptom and not the problem. And I seem to really like problems. Can we figure out the cause of the missing fluid? Let's give it a try. The braking system in a car is closed and does not consume fluid in use. The usual reasons for dropping brake fluid levels are worn brake pads or a leak. Since there haven't been any telltale spots underneath the car on the garage floor, this is a bit of a mystery. The first thing I want to do is a pressure test to see if there's any leaks in the system. If you're going to do any work with brakes, I highly recommend getting yourself a power bleeder. Not only does it make bleeding brakes a one-person job, it can also be used to pressure test the system. I'm pressurizing the system to 15 psi for 20 minutes. I'm looking for a drop in the pressure gauge, which would indicate a leak in the system. Interesting side note on this process later in the video. After 20 minutes, my conclusion is that there's no major leak, and my next step will be to check the pad wear. Since I'm going to have the wheels off and it's almost been 10 years since I've done any work on the brakes, I figured I may as well flush and replace the fluid. According to this cheap and possibly reliable fluid life meter, the fluid's still okay, but let's flush it. To start off, I'm removing as much of the old fluid as I safely can. It's interesting to note that there is a second reservoir in the back of the fluid tank that I can't access in order to drain, so in reality, removing the old fluid really doesn't help much, as it still needs to all get flushed through anyway, but no harm done. In actuality, it's probably better. The last thing you want to do is drain all the fluid and risk air getting into the master cylinder or the ABS system. That would be a whole other video. I fill the bleeder jug half full, about 48 ounces of brake fluid, and pressurize the system to 10 psi. I'll leave links to all the tools that I've used in this project in the description below. Starting at the furthest wheel from the master cylinder, which on most cars is the passenger rear, I jack up the car and remove the wheel. You certainly don't need an impact driver to remove the 17mm lug bolts. A breaker bar will do the same job just as well. I don't drive this car in the winter anymore, but it sat outside for years when I lived in Boston and the salt kind of took its toll. I'm considering doing a suspension restoration. If you have any interest in a video like that, let me know in the comments. The point of getting in here is to check the wear on the brake pads, and these look great. This car doesn't get a lot of miles, so I'm not surprised, but I see no reason for low brake fluid here. The rear brakes take a 7mm wrench on the bleeder nipple. Simply attach a catch bottle, crack the bleeder open, and let the old fluid purge out of the line. This first one I'll let run for a while to flush out both the brake line and the reservoir. Snug down the bleeder when done, but do not over-tighten. Also, make sure to put the pad wear sensor wire back in its clip on the bleeder cap. I like to clean off the hub as well as the mating surface on the wheel. I also use a little anti-seize out of habit from living in the rust zone. Reinstall the wheel and torque to 90 foot-pounds. Next is the driver's side rear. The process is the same. Jack up and remove the wheel. This time, however, I lifted awkwardly and threw out my back. That put a halt to the fun for a day while I iced, heated, and tried to rest my old aching back. Not to be deterred, the next day I was back at it. These pads also checked out fine for wear, so I proceeded to the flush. Same process as before. It's not uncommon for a bit of fluid to seep out around the threads of the nipple when it's cracked. A quick hit of some brake clean and it's good to go. Now that's just some extra brake clean that was trapped in the boot. It dried momentarily. As with the passenger rear, I cleaned up the hub, the wheel, applied some anti-seize, installed the wheel, and torqued to 90 foot-pounds. The front passenger side now, and more of the same. Pads look great, and I'm starting to wonder where I could be losing that fluid. Interesting note, for some reason the front bleeder requires an 8mm wrench. I found it interesting that I was getting a few bubbles on this line. I'll let it go until there's no more bubbles present. Another interesting find is the bushing material lying in the strut well. Looks like those need some work also. Remember what I said about a 26-year-old car? As before, I cleaned the hub. I did clean the wheel and apply anti-seize off camera. Install the wheel and torque again to 90 foot-pounds. In the home stretch, raise the driver front side, remove the wheel carefully, remembering the back issues. And oh, what have we here? Looks like a leak. A theory starts to form, so I figured I'd clean this up with brake clean and test out my hypothesis. Leaving the system pressurized overnight, hypothesis confirmed, a leaking bleeder. Checking things out the next morning, it was very clear that the front driver's side bleeder was leaking. Why didn't this show up during the leak test in the beginning of the video? 20 minutes just is not enough time for the leak to form. In the time lapse of the overnight test, no sign of the leak showed up until about an hour and a half into the test. So I need a new bleeder. I released the pressure on the system and removed the bad bleeder to take it on my little adventure. I find it's always best if you can have the part in hand when you go to the store. That way a go, no-go test can be easily done, and it usually saves a lot of headache. Off I went to my neighborhood Napa. Unfortunately, they had no 8mm bleeders, only 7mm. Headache starting. So I had to drive an extra hour to get the right one. Back from my scenic tour with part in hand, here's the old one, the new one, and the Napa part number. Here's a close-up of what happens when you over-torque and crush these bleeders, compared to a new one. Reinstall the new bleeder, clean up the area with some brake clean, pressurize the system back to 10 psi, and finish flushing the system. One more hit of brake clean and it's time for an overnight test. As before, I left the system pressurized and no more leaks over a 12-hour period. I also check all the other bleeders off camera. No more leaks in the system. So why did I never see drips on the floor of the garage? My conclusion is if the system was not under pressure or the brake pedal was not depressed, there was not enough pressure to push fluid past the crushed bleeder. But over 10 years of driving and applying the brakes on the road, enough fluid was forced out to finally cause the fluid light to just start to flicker when the car was not level and the brakes were being applied. I was concerned, however, that the brake fluid may have contaminated the brake pads, so I wanted to check on those. I removed the caliper and hung it from the strut spring to ease the tension on the brake line. The pads ended up looking fine, but the slide pins were pretty gunked up, so I cleaned them up with a wire wheel and an abrasive pad. Note: be careful when filming and using a wire wheel around something that it can catch on. You'll have a mess in short order. I lightly wire brushed and cleaned up all the mating surfaces as well as the rotor. I used a small amount of brake parts lube on the ears of the pads as well as the back of the front pad. Now there's always an ongoing debate as to whether this lube is necessary. Let me know what your opinions are about this in the comments. Something that is important is to lube the slide pins. I'm using some Sil Glide here that I picked up at Napa. I've read good things about it. If you're enjoying this video, please strike a like and consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. The slide pins get torqued to 20 foot-pounds with a 7mm hex bit. Lastly, I reinstalled the retaining clip, the dust caps for the slide pins, cleaned the hub, and reinstalled the brake pad wear sensor. As usual, I cleaned up the wheel, applied anti-seize, reinstalled, and torqued the lugs to 90 foot-pounds. Finally, it was time to relieve the pressure and remove the bleeder system. I took out enough fluid to bring the level just below the max fill line since my brake pads still had a lot of meat left on them. Installed the cap and the sensor connection and called this job done. Well, that ended up being a bit more involved than I originally thought, especially because I wanted to check those brake pads for contamination. But it's not a difficult job, and with the pressurized bleeder, you can flush the whole system in about 45 minutes. Now, there's a lot of rust under my Z, and I'm thinking I want to do something about that. Good winter project, maybe. I also want to take a moment to thank Mark over his great channel dedicated to Z3s called Moment of Zed. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description below. He gave me a wonderful shout out in his latest video. Check him out and subscribe to his channel. Mark, thank you so much for your kind words, and I love the color of your car. The release of this video marks 500 subscribers for my channel. I am astounded and so appreciate each of you that's subscribed. I have more ideas for future videos and your support really inspires me to give it a try. Well, if you like this video, please strike a like and leave a comment below. I always enjoy responding to your thoughts. Until next time, I'm mainejason. Get out there and give it a try.